Viability rankings are a very good way of understanding a metagame, as it shows you what's good, such as the S ranks, Diglett and Toad School, or what's kind of okay. Just keep it in mind, but it's not that big of a deal, such as Voikoko or Reavard, that sort of stuff. How do I build teams that are really good against all this sorts of stuff? How do I do that? Well, you could always go over to sample teams, where we have very expert players who know what they're doing. They'll make their own teams, and then you can use them yourself. But the issue there is that it's very impersonal, you know? You don't really... It's not really you. So how do I make it so that way I can build my own team, but also something that I know what I'm doing, so that way I can then go on and have a lot more self-expression in my teams? Well, that's where good cores come in. This is from Sword and Shield. We haven't made one for Scarlet and Violet yet, but I have made my own selection of good cores for new players or veteran players if they were looking for something to team build around. I have my own, and I'm hoping to impart this knowledge on everybody so that way you can build a lot more teams a lot more efficiently. And if you ever need, oh, well, I want to build something that's more balance-oriented, or I want to build something that's more defensive or hyper-offense, that's what I'm hoping to help with today. Now, before I get into it, if you could like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff for the YouTube algorithm, I'd very much appreciate it. If I can turn this into a job as opposed to a part-time hobby, I'd very much appreciate it. Starting off with defensive cores, we have Quaxley plus Toad School or Fungus, either works. Point is that you have access to Rapid Spin, you have Liquidation as good stab, you have Encore, which can really annoy your opponent, and you have Reliable Recovery with Roost, combined with either of these mushrooms, because Toad School's a mushroom, it's just very weird. But both of these work really well at shoring up Quaxley's electric-type weakness due to pure water. It's very good, but it's weak to grass and electric, so having either Fungus with a quadruple grass resistance and an electric resist, or Toad School over here with a electric immunity because of the ground typing is always really nice. In addition, because you have two rapid spinners, it makes it really easy to keep hazards off. You also have access to knockoff, which enables Quaxly's Moxie ability to sometimes come into play, which means that despite the fact that you're a defensive Pokemon, you can have offensive pressure, which is really nice. You can also get a whole bunch of free turns because Quaxly's Encore combined with Fungus's Spore. It's all really nice. Earth Power is good for breaking over fire types as well as poisons. It's just some naturally nice stuff to have. And it really works out pretty well. And you can see it a lot in high-level play of having cores of Quaxly plus Toad School. For example, Yellowfin has Larvesta and Wattrel, both of which are weak to rocks. So having two spinners that are also really good defensively can put a lot of pressure on your opponent to have to keep those rocks up. And it's going to be really hard for them to keep it up. As a result, pretty good defensive core. Also, if you add in Larvesta, then it also helps cover the grass weakness, because Quax is weak, Toad is neutral, but this is a quad resist, and if there's any physical grass type attackers, you can punish them really well as a result of U-turn. You have fire moves such as Flare Blitz. You also have Flame Body to burn the opponent, which can also facilitate a Quaxly sweep, which also lets Toad School come in more often and fire off more knockoffs, all that good stuff. Next up is Toad School plus Marionette. So you also want to have a grounded poison for all of your defensive cores, and the reason for that is toxic spikes are quite prevalent in the metagame as a result of Glimmet, which I'll get to in other cores. But you want to be able to absorb those, otherwise you're going to have a really rough time of it. You can run teams that don't have a grounded poison on the condition that you don't have very many grounded Pokemon in the first place, or any that would be affected by toxic spikes, but that's more advanced tech. I'd much more suggest running Toad School or Mare. And they cover each other quite well as a result of Mare covering the fire weakness that Toad School has, Toad School covering the ground weakness that Marionette has, and also just having some nice synergy of being able to keep themselves healthy, which you can run Earth Power, you can also run Giga Drain, and make it more specially offensive if you want. There's a lot of flexibility when it comes to Toad School spreads, but being able to have Giga Drain to threaten out other waters that Mary doesn't... It's not bad versus, but it's just very awkward because it can't hit them super effectively, so it all depends on how you want to play it. They're very well suited for each other, being able to remove hazards, being able to wear down the opponent with either knockoff removing Eviolite, which boosts defense and special defense by 1.5 times, Marionette being able to use Toxic Spikes or Sludge Bomb, and also keeping itself weak with Recover. Very good stuff. And we can see that used Here with Balor, in addition to Fungus plus Quaxley core, Balor brings Toad School plus Marionade. Very good defensive core. Very useful overall. Elfuzion also brought this versus Toki with that sort of core, and then you also have offensive pressure. It's very common, and you'll see it used for good reason. Next up, the final defensive core. You can run all three of these at once or mix and match, but you have Drifloon, Larvesta, Mudbray. And the reason why these function so well together is because they cover each other's weaknesses quite well. Drifloon is the only viable defogger in the tier, and that means that you have guaranteed rocks removal, so that helps support Larvesta. Larvesta also deals with the grasses that annoy Mudbray. Drifloon does this too, but Larvesta is more consistent because it runs Eviolite most of the time. And then Mudbray's ground typing gives it electric immunity, which Drifloon greatly appreciates. It does not want to have to deal with stuff like Wattrel and Voltorb. It's quite annoying. Pawniard annoys Drifloon because it can... If it's Scarf, it can attack into it. It has Sucker Punch. It has a lot of annoying tools that Drifloon really doesn't want to have to deal with. So having Larvesta to burn it with Flame Body, so that way whenever it uses a physical attack, it has a 30% chance to be burned. Or using Mudbray with Stamina, which raises its defense after its damage, can be very nice ways to deal with it. Finally, Will-O-Wisp support from Drifloon and Larvesta makes Mudbray take physical attacks even better. I mean, being able to stamina up, take a whole bunch of hits, and then also not have to worry about any really big attacks coming in because Larvesta and Drifloon both have Will-O-Wisp support. Pretty fantastic. Also, Mudbray has a rock resistance, which both Drifloon and Larvesta hate, so that's always really nice to have. They just synergize very well together. They're a bit slow because Larvesta doesn't have a lot of speed, Mudbray doesn't either, but they can be really hard to break over, especially when they have reliable recovery in Rest from Mudbray and Morning Sun from Larvesta. Drifloon doesn't have that, but it's very offensively threatening, where the other two are a little bit more passive. Very good core. And then we can see partial here with Danny YSB brings Drifloon plus Mudbray. Really good at dealing with opposing electrics because, you know, Mudbray just takes attacks like it's nobody's business, and then the grass types that would otherwise annoy it, such as Dealing, well, they get hit really, really hard by Drifloon's acrobatics, so that's really nice. Very good synergy, and it's just not something that you really think of like, oh yeah, Drifloon plus Mudbray or Larvesta. It's a little bit more uncommon, but it's still very good. And that's all for the defensive cores that I have for the time being. Next up is balance cores. Balance is more about a combination of offense and defense and how they can really combine well together. You have Pawniard with Iron Head, Sucker Punch, Low Sweep, and then you have Swords Dance or Stealth Rock. It all depends on how you want to play it. Swords Dance is on the default set. If you do import-export, it'll do offensive Swords Dance, but Stealth Rock is still really nice. And what that allows it to do is that because Toad School is weak to fire types, then you can punish them coming in by having Stealth Rocks up. In addition, Toad School's knockoff, which can remove Eviolites, means that Pawniard, if it's running Swords Dance, has a much easier time breaking over the opponent. Spore from Toad School can give Swords Dance Pawniard additional setup opportunities. And you can also, in addition to the fire, you have a bug weakness on Toad, which is really annoying because of stuff like Larvesta and Nimble, and Pawniard being able to set up Stealth Rocks is really good support for Toad. In addition, you get to keep your own Stealth Rocks off because of Rapid Spin, so that's all pretty cool. Also, because you have Earth Power, you can threaten out really annoying things that Pawn doesn't want to have to deal with, such as Mare, because Mare can wall it pretty effectively if it doesn't have Night Slash and Swords Dance. It needs to have those two in order to break over Mare, so it's just a lot easier to deal with if Toad can knock it off and Earth Power it. So it's pretty nice. It also has, Pawniard has an Ice Resistance, meaning that Toad School's only quadruple weakness, that's what I'm thinking of, is now covered by Pawniard, which can deal with it pretty well because it has Iron Head, Sucker Punch, Low Sweep. It's got really good coverage moves. And we can see it on Doug's team here. We have Toad plus Pawniard. This team is really good in general just because it has a lot of bulky mons that are hard to break over, and you still have offensive presence. And I'll get over to these two later. But you also have the defensive core from earlier of Marionade plus Toad, and then you have Toad plus Pawn. Really good synergy. Next up we have Glimmet plus Toad, and the reason why these two work so well together is that Toad's ground resistance really combos well with Glimmet's quadruple ground weakness. in addition to setting up hazards such as Stealth Rocket and Toxic Debris, you set up your own hazards while Toad School gets rid of your opponents. Really nice there. Also, you have Power Gems, so that way you can once again deal with the Bug and Fire types that would otherwise annoy Toad. So that's pretty cool. You also get to threaten the ground types because Toad is part grass, so that's pretty cool. You can either use Power Whip, which, although it's less accurate than some other moves, it has a really high base power to compensate, or Giga Drain, which keeps you healthy over the course of the match. So you have a lot of utility as a result, and you combo really well. It's pretty fantastic. Also, one of the things that Toad really doesn't like is Toxic Spikes. They're just really annoying to switch into because you really like Toad's longevity, especially when it has such a good special defense stat. So being able to absorb those and being able to throw them onto the opponent are really fantastic. Excuse me. Also, Power Gem helps deal with the flying types that Toad doesn't like, such as Wattrel or Drifloon. So it combos quite well. So there's the Doug's game. Arnicana, aka Drifting, has Glimmet plus Toad, and then once again, Toad School plus Pawniard. That works really well together, so it's pretty nice. Next up, we have Deerling plus Glimmet or Mare, and the reason why this is that Deerling's main strategy is to use Paraflinch from Headbutt or Zen Headbutt, so that way your opponent can't move. You also have Thunder Wave if you want to run that. You don't have to, but the reason why that's important is that you typically spend a lot of time with Deerling out just clicking Headbutt or Zen Headbutt, and that wastes a lot of turns. And the best way to use these turns is to have your opponent be poisoned by Glimmet's Toxic Debris, setting up Toxic Spikes, or Marianne setting up Toxic Spikes itself. And also, Deerling really hates having to deal with Toxic Spikes as a result of having to be in for so many turns. You only have so many Synthesis. So by being able to absorb that, it's really fantastic. And also because of the normal grass typing, you have a ground resistance. If you want to, you can also run a grass type move to threaten the ground types, such as Bullet Seed. You can also run Seed Bomb, but because of how rolls work, Bullet Seed is preferred. You also have Trailblaze if you want. That one's kind of fun. It's a tech option, but I would much rather recommend either of Bullet Seed or Thunder Wave instead. So that's pretty cool. But you can waste a lot of turns, which can wear down your opponent really well. So that's really fantastic. Also, by having the additional chip damage from the poison, it just puts your opponents on even more of a timer, which can open up some of your more offensive threats, such as with the previous balance cores, such as Pawniard, because you have really good, really offensive pressure with Swords Dance, that sort of stuff. I'm not going to... Alright. So... And it's just really easy to be able to break over your opponent when you have a lot of support from Stealth Rocks or Spikes, make you really hard to switch into, and wear down your opponent that way. It's really nice. So then... Toki brought this strategy with Deerling plus Glimmet versus Elfuzion. This is from Little Cup Winter League. This is where all these games come from, except for one, because I had to find the example. But... really good at defensive core because it takes a lot of attacks from Toad, covers that weakness that Glimmet has otherwise, so pretty good. Next up, Glimmet plus Grievard, and I have a very good script for this because Grievard's main weakness is its passivity, as it cannot use very strong moves to threaten the opponent. It's got weak ones like Shadow Sneak, Ice Fang, and Stomping Tantrum. They're good, but their base power is pretty low. In order to shore up this weakness, you can use Glimmet, due to its entry hazards, as in Toxic Spikes to wear down the enemy. Grievard, being a ghost type, blocks Rapid Spin to keep these hazards up. Grievard can also punish poison types wanting to come in to absorb Toxic Spikes using Stomping Tantrum, as well as forcing switches via Yawn. You can also use Rest, or Roar for that matter. So you have Yawn to force switches, you have Roar to literally force your opponent in if you want to, and then Rest makes it so that way you're really hard to break over and you're wasting even more turns. Really good stuff. It synergizes exceedingly well, and it's pretty incredible how good it is. Although Grievard has been falling off in recent memory because Zoro H exists, and that's really bad for it, being able to run these two really enables some sweepers, such as Scarf Sandile, as in this replay. It's really, really good. It just synergizes very well. You can deal with special attackers such as Drifloons, such as Wattrel because of the rocks, and then this can deal with a lot of physical attackers such as Quacks, such as Toad School, all that sorts of stuff. It really synergizes well. It's just kind of funny that they're really not right next to each other in the Pokedex, Greavard and Glimmet. It's almost like they were made to work together. It's pretty crazy. Next up, we have the more bulky offensive cores, and this is characterized more by, like, you have the explicitly defensive Pokemon, such as Deerling. It's not meant to do a lot of damage. Marini's meant to take a lot of hits, all that sorts of stuff. Whereas a more bulky offense is that you sort of have a good middle ground between offenses and defenses, such as Glimmet. It has a good defensive typing because it can take a lot of hits. It has Toxic Debris, which can punish switches, or not switches, stray physical attacks, all that sorts of stuff. So, what happens if we keep on stacking more things like Glimmet that are really good, that you want to have as both the defensive and offensive presence? Well, the first one, there's 4 of them, but you can kind of mix and match between 1, 2, and 3, or just Pawniard and Crabrawler. But Gothita, Pawniard, Crabrawler is a really good defensive core, as well as offensive, because they cover each other's weaknesses really well. My Crabrawler it's kind of weak to ghost types, so, well, I have a Pawniard, so that means it can deal with those ghost types, but then it's kind of weak to fighting types, because it's got the Dark Steel typing, which gives it a quadruple weakness to fighting types, so that's not great. Oh, but I have a Psychic type, and it can also trap them with Shadow Tag, so that means I don't have to deal with that, so it's really great. But then I won't have Dark types, though. Dark types are really annoying for Psychics, because, you don't get to use Psychic type moves versus them. Oh, but I got Crab, so, it's a nice little 3-way partnership of Crab covering Gothita's and Pawniard's weaknesses, Pawniard covering Gothita's and Crab's weaknesses, and then Gothita covering the other 2. It's really, really good synergy. And also a bit of speed control, because you can run Choice Scarf Gothita, so that's really nice. And also because you have the trapping ability of Shadow Tag, both of these can be setup sweepers because of Swords Dance and Bulk Up on Crabrawler. So, what you can do from there is use that to break over the opponents, making it a very good bulky core because of how bulky everything is, except for Gothita because of the Scarf. But it helps break over teams really, really reliably. Next up, Zorua H. I'm not a big fan of Terra Blast. You can run the U-turn instead, but it all depends on how you want to play it. But Pawniard, Crabrawler, and Zorua H work really well. Crabrawler, once again, I have to worry about my ghost types. Well, now I have Zorua H, which blanks Shadow type, like Shadow Ball, not Shadow type moves, normal ghost typing, so it can take normal and ghost type attacks really well, as well as fighting moves, so it supports Pawniard really well, and Pawniard supports it pretty well, because it doesn't have to deal with those ghosts anywhere near as much, or dark types for that matter. They both really cover dark types well, because Pawniard has low sweep, has a resistance to it because it's a dark type in and of itself. Crab can hit it really hard with Drain Punchers, and once again, you still have Pawniard and Crabrawler synergy, which works really well. So we have this game, Toki, Kither. Kither brought versus Drud all 4 of these Pokemon. Show how good their synergy really is. It's pretty crazy. I wouldn't necessarily recommend Gothita plus Zorua H because they're sort of doing different things, but it's still really good to be able to Will-O-Wisp some threats on the opponent's team, be able to set up with Pawniard and Crab, and then once they're weakened because of Will-O-Wisp or Knock support that Zorua H has, well then Gothita can come in and not absorb those, and then break over those later in the game. Really good stuff. This synergized surprisingly well. It's pretty great. Next up, we have Diglett plus the electric types. The Diglett set depends on the team, depends on how you want to run it, but you have Life Orb or Eviolite. And then you have very fast pivot in Voltorb, which can be really annoying to deal with because of Volt Switch. Or you can run the slower, but a fantastic defensive typing in Wattrel. It became so annoying to deal with in some games, it's pretty crazy. But essentially what you would do is, Diglett's main claim to fame is that it has Arena Trap, and Arena Trap does really well at breaking over an opponent's defensive core because they can't switch out, and if you're running the Life Orb set, it's even harder to deal with. So in order to make sure that Diglett stays healthy, because its defenses are pretty bad, 10, 25, 45, very, very, very frail, you instead could run a much more bulkier bonds, such as Voltorb. 40 HP, 50 defense, 55 special defense is nothing to scoff at. That's pretty good. Or you can run Wattrel, which has reliable recovery, and Roost, a fantastic electric flying defensive typing, in addition to Volt Absorb. It can be really hard to break over. And because both of them have Volt Switch, you can get in Diglett really easily versus stuff that otherwise wouldn't want to have to deal with Diglett. So you got a lot of good momentum as a result. It's still very bulky because Voltorb and Wattrel are pretty standard when it comes to how good they are. Like, this is not the best defenses, but because of Eviolite plus Roost, in addition to having Volt Absorb, it can be really long. It can really last long over the course of the game, just because it doesn't die. And Voltorb's defenses are really good, and it's really hard to hit in the first place because it's got Volt Switch, Protect if you want to run that. You also have stuff like Taunt, and you have good defenses and a really fast typing that's also really naturally fast, so it's really hard for your opponent to be able to keep up with Voltorb plus Diglett. They work really well together. And then, perfect example, oh look, I have Diglett and Wattrel on my opponent's team, but then also, I'm running it myself because I have Voltorb and Diglett. And you still have the defensive cores from earlier. You have stuff like Mariani plus Toad, you have Pawniard plus Gothita, all that sorts of stuff. Just shows, like, those are some pretty widespread ones that people really like using. Now that we've done we have defensive cores, balanced cores, and bulky offense cores, now we have to go to hyper-offensive cores. And they're more about breaking over the opponent as fast as possible. And perhaps the poster child of this is Nimble. And Nimble even fits on some balance builds because of its weird nature. But the main thing that it's supposed to do is come in, do a lot of damage for you, Tinted Lens. It can revenge kill because of First Impression. It can gain momentum because of U-turn. It can keep itself healthy because of Leech Life. It's really hard to deal with. In order to make this even more powerful, you combine it with either of the trappers of Gothita or Diglett, and that makes it really hard to stop because, oh, well, I have my Mariani. It's a good resistance, so that way I can deal with Nimble a lot better. Well, I could just U-turn on your Mariani coming in, and then when you're supported by Gothita and Diglett, it becomes a crazy offensive presence that's really hard to stop. So, for an example, this BB Skarm brought this, Nimble plus Diglett, and then you also have other U-turn supports, such as from Zorua H. It can be really, really hard to deal with. Next up, we have Surskit plus Zorua H, and the reason why that works so well is because Surskit likes to set Sticky Web, and what Sticky Web does is that it lowers the speed of grounded foes by 1 on Switch In. So, in order to really annoy your opponent by doing that, you have Zorua H, which is a ghost type that also has Nasty Plot, which can be a sweeper, and also really appreciates the speed being dropped in order to break over your opponent. You have Tear Blast Fighting, so that way you can deal with Pawniard. You have Dark Pulse if you want to run that. You also have Extra Sensory. All on how you want to run it. So, go wild. It's crazy. And I believe Elfu brought this. Yes, Elfu brought this. And he won with Nasty Plot Spam Webs, his own revision of it. That was pretty good. And actually, we can see it. The disguise working really well here. Of Nasty Plot. Well, is this Stunky or is this Zorua H? Stunky also works really well with this core because you get to absorb Toxic Spikes in addition to, oh, well, is this Zorua H or is this something else? The simple answer is it's Zorua H with Extra Sensory, so it kills it. But it's really hard to deal with as a result, so it's pretty cool. The next one that we have, Zorua U. So the Dark type Zorua plus Impidimp, Shelter, Choodle. This is all hyper offensive stuff because what Zorua U does that Zorua H can't really do is a much stronger knockoff, and it's much better user of Memento. I mean, Memento is sort of a niche case, but it still has a lot of usage as a result because, oh yeah, I have knockoff plus U-turn, so you can take some attacks, be able to weaken your opponent really hard, and then you have Sucker Punch to wear them down even further. And then you have Impidimp, which is the screen setter. It has Reflect plus Light Screen, and then has the addition of Parting Shot. And it has Prankster. It's really hard to deal with on certain team structures because, oh yeah, I want to be able to break over Impidimp, but I can't because it has Reflect Light Screen. And the only way to get rid of this 8 turns of Reflect and Light Screen is to knock it off, which isn't going to do a lot of damage because it resists Dark-type moves, and also it can set up Reflect beforehand. It can be really annoying. And you'll be wondering, well, what exactly do I want to support with these screen support? Shell Smashers. Shell Smashers are really, really powerful. And what they do is that you click Shell Smash, and then they go Burr, because it just becomes stupidly hard to deal with. Because at +2, Rock Blast KOs a whole bunch of stuff, and because you can knock some things off, then, oh, guess what? The stuff that I can usually use to check it, I can't anymore, so now I'm really in the back foot. And then you still have defensive utility via Ice Shard or Liquidation. And Shelter I prefer, but you can still use Choodle. But I prefer Shelter because it's got a really good defense stat of 100, so you can set up on quite a few physical attackers. Choodle's not bad either. I've optimized the spread a little bit because you no longer need the 30 speed. There's no real reason to. But it still can be really threatening, especially when paired with Shelter. So you can just have the two of them. They cover each other's checks really well because Choodle can break over, like, what are you going to use against it? Stuff like Mariani, stuff like Toad School with Terra. Well, what happens if I have two of them? And now you've already used up half of its HP to deal with one. So what are you going to do now? And they synergize pretty well together. But Choodle has Strong Jaw, Boosted Crunch, Ice Fang. You can also run Stomping Tantrum for Pawniard. All depends on how you want to run it. And Choodle has more special defense than Shelter, because Shelter's just pretty terrible. And Choodle isn't as powerful, but it still can do a lot of damage with Strong Jaw, Boosted Crunches, and also Terra-type Dark, so that way you can resist Sucker Punches, be immune to Prankster moves, which Shelter can't really do because it needs Terra-type Rock for Rock Blast, and that's not the best defensive typing. But I'm sorry, dude, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Shrikoko? Shiroko? But he brought that versus me in Seasonal, and that's just because the reason why I'm using this is just because Impidimp isn't very commonly seen. It's just that it's quite the investment in order to make to have this work, because you need to have a very specific setup. You can't really put this on a balanced team because it's meant to set up sweepers such as Choodle, Sinistea, Nummel. Oh god, Nummel. No, or Shelter. That's the main thing that it's supposed to do. So it's really hard otherwise to have Impidimp on teams, but when you're supporting Hyper Offense, it gets pretty crazy. And as an example of this, even though I have this is a really threatening Zorua H right now, and even though it's at -3, it can still do a lot of damage. And you may be thinking, oh, well, Better Mouse should just kill Choodle, right? No, it doesn't because of Light Screen, and that's really annoying to deal with as a result. So, even though these aren't the bulkiest mons with screen support, they can get a lot done. And that's all of them. If you have any other ideas for cores, leave them in the comments down below. I'd very much appreciate it. Thank you all very much for watching. If you could like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Any support is very much appreciated. Thank you all very much, and have a good day.